Hello. Welcome to the podcast channel of the Chair in Contemporary Strategic Issues. This episode is an excerpt from a lecture given by Mr. Husain Haqqani, former Pakistani ambassador to the United States and director of South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. The conference is entitled, Military Alliances in Emerging Southern Countries. We hope you enjoy listening, and to support us, don't forget to subscribe to our various channels.
Thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today among all of you. And thank you also for the very kind introduction. The subject I am going to try and broach today is a complex one. There is no single definition of the Global South. Every element of the Global South differs from one another. And we are living at a time in the world in which military alliances no longer have the same level of commitment that they used to have at one time in history. In February 1998, Madeleine Albright, who was then the U.S. Secretary of State, defended U.S. coercive diplomacy against Iraq in relation to its limited cooperation with the United Nations Weapons of Mass Destruction inspectors in a television interview. And she used the words as follows. She said, "If we have to use force, it is because we are America." Qu'est-ce qui marche pas? Just a minute. Bon, ça va être établi. Vous y arrivez? Translation. Entendu, translation. Sound. Ça va? Arrivé? C'est bon? Ouais. C'est bien protester.
Protesting is good when things don't work.
Ah ben voilà, c'est très bien. Ça veut dire que vous êtes au moins...
So this means that at least people listen to you intently.
On en était à Madeleine Albright, elle a dit...
We were speaking about Madeleine Albright.
Words, I will repeat again. She said, if we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future. And we see the danger here to all of us. Thus, the term indispensable nation came into popular use to describe America's centrality and criticality to the liberal rule-based order that evolved after the end of the Second World War. Today, under President Donald Trump, the United States wants to be anything but indispensable. Trump has made it clear that he finds the US-led international order as disadvantageous to Americans. In a recent speech, he said, "For years, Washington was controlled by a sinister group of radical left Marxists. I am sure that George W. Bush and his father would be very upset at being called Marxist. The radical left Marxists, warmongers, and corrupt special interests who drained our wealth, attacked our liberties, obliterated our borders, and sucked our country dry." The focus of US policy, according to Trump, is not going to be on ensuring global peace and security, as it has avowedly been since 1945, but to enrich America, or at least part of America. President Trump wants to restrict imports and immigrants and wants allies to pay for their own defense. This affects the developed countries of the North and the developing nations of the South differently. Europe, for instance, has looked to the US for its security in the military context. The countries of the global South have sought economic and political security as well as military equipment and training. The end of America's role as global security provider has significant ramifications for both its richer and poorer partners. In 1945, the US and the Soviet Union had emerged as the leaders of the two poles of a bipolar world. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 resulted in a unipolar moment. The notion of indispensable nation was a product of that unipolarity. It resulted in some expensive and inadequately productive deployments of force by the United States and resulted in disenchantment among a section of Americans with the idea of spending American resources to manage global order. As the leader of the American movement of those disenchanted with globalism, President Trump wants to cut deals with autocrats such as Russia's Vladimir Putin or North Korea's Kim Jong-un. He would like to end wars, reduce tensions in trouble spots, and allow the United States to focus on its own prosperity. Now, the desire to end wars and to concentrate on producing wealth is not new to Americans. President Woodrow Wilson, who is much disliked by Trump and his followers, led the US into the First World War with the slogan, "A war to end all wars." The post-Second World War idea of ideological dominance against communism and the post-Cold War hope that the triumph of free markets and democracy might mark the end of history were also reflections of a similar happily ever after concept of world affairs. President Trump, too, will find that dissolving existing coalitions and institutions might not necessarily have the outcome that he desires. By withdrawing the US from the arena, he might end up hastening the emergence of a multipolar world and thereby reduce America's clout significantly. As it is, other major powers have been active in creating their own structures independent of the United States. We have seen the emergence of BRICS Plus, OPEC Plus, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. On the other hand, China, North Korea, and Iran have joined with Russia at different levels to disrupt global order. It is unlikely that these groupings will collapse just because President Trump wishes them to fail. The more likely outcome is the end of America's role as indispensable nation and the rebirth of an era of regional military alliances amidst multiple layers of distrust among nations. Distrust of Donald Trump and the United States under his presidency being the top and most prominent layer. Where would the nations of the global South fit in this new picture? For the industrialized world, such as Europe, the issue is to increase defense spending and persuade the young to serve in their military. But the countries of the South, already resource deficient, will need to diversify their military alliances to ensure reliable supply of equipment as well as opportunities for training and military education. US scholar Joseph Nye has argued that there are too many conflicts among states in the global South for the countries to have a unified voice. Military cooperation is even more difficult. The issue is not just the absence of firepower. Several global South countries have large militaries, including China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Brazil. 3 countries in the global South, China, India, and Pakistan are declared nuclear weapons powers. Several have large indigenous military equipment manufacturing capabilities, but most have unresolved border conflicts or regional rivalries. There are several possible combinations of rivals competing with one another, and there is a lesser prospect of a global South military alliance. For example, China and Pakistan are more likely to cooperate against India, as they already do, then it is likely that China and India or India and Pakistan could become allies. It is important to recall that the term Global South emerged as an alternative to Cold War era term Third World, describing economically disadvantaged nation states. The South is not merely a geographical region, but a political space that has been shaped by shared problems, shared post-colonial heritage, and similar power structures. There are approximately 130 to 150 countries typically classified as part of the Global South, though this number varies depending on the specific definition used. These countries cover most of Africa, large parts of Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and parts of Oceania, minus Australia and New Zealand. During the Cold War, much of the radical rhetoric about the Global South related to shared experiences of subjugation under global capitalism. But in the political and strategic realm, it can best be traced back to the non-aligned movement, established in 1961, which sought to create an independent political and economic bloc free from Western and Soviet influence. The concept has become popular once again since 2022, very recently, when some countries expressed concern over playing the role of just supporting characters in the drama of multilateral institutions and forums. They want a bigger role. They want to be the heroes of their own story. The G20, with equal representation from the global North and South, experienced a clash between the two binaries over the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Most of the global North took a strong stand against Russia, but global South countries were cautious in condemning Russia to protect their individual interests. Apart from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the global South also had complaints relating to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Several countries complained that the world's developed states, particularly the United States, waited for their entire population to be vaccinated before offering or sharing the COVID-19 vaccine with the more vulnerable populace of the global South. Countries ranging from Brazil and India to the United Arab Emirates have initiated cooperative efforts to articulate a global South perspective on major issues confronting the world since then. As chair of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28, the UAE organized meetings of global South countries on issues of common concern. In 2023, Mexico and Brazil offered alternative proposals for ending the conflict in Ukraine. Although there is a lack of homogeneity in views, global South countries try now to engage more with one another. Reprising its leading role in the non-aligned movement of the Cold War era, India has organized a Voice of Global South Summit since 2023. Leaders and ministers from 125 countries of the Global South participated in the first summit, which included 29 countries from Latin America and Caribbean, 47 countries from Africa, 7 countries from Europe, 31 countries from Asia, and 11 countries from Oceania. Calls for paying closer attention to the Global South to make institutions more effective have grown. India and China are vying to emerge as leaders of a new bloc of nations. China's Belt and Road Initiative is an instrument for winning friends and influence over poorer countries, while India is developing its own connectivity projects and has increased development assistance. Some have even suggested that a sympathetic country from the global north, and this would be of interest to the people in this room, that an interested country from the global, sympathetic country from the global north, such as France, can be a major player in leading or guiding the global south. This view has been voiced particularly by some Indian scholars. So far, the global south's reemergence has been more about airing political views and increased participation in international conflict resolution processes than exercises of hard power. There are several unresolved issues with the conceptualization of the term Global South, which is geographically imprecise and historically problematic. Many countries classified as part of the Global South are not in the Southern Hemisphere, like China, India, and much of the Middle East. Conversely, high-income countries like Australia and New Zealand are in the Southern Hemisphere but are not considered part of the Global South. Moreover, the term lumps together countries with vastly different economic conditions. Emerging economies like China and India, middle-income countries like Brazil and Mexico, and low-income countries across Africa and parts of Asia. This oversimplification obscures the significant economic differences between these nations and their distinct developmental challenges. There is also a lack of political homogeneity. The Global South encompasses countries with diverse political systems, from democracies to authoritarian regimes. Using a single term suggests political unity or shared governance approach that simply does not exist. The term may inadvertently reinforce colonial-era divisions between developed and developing countries. It maintains a binary worldview that risks perpetuating stereotypes and overlooking the complex realities of each country's unique circumstances. The world has changed significantly since the term first gained popularity in the post-colonial era. With the rise of China and other emerging economies, the traditional North-South divide has become increasingly relevant to describing global power dynamics, at least in the eyes of some. Indian strategist C. Raja Mohan argues that speaking of the Global South denies agency to individual countries by treating them as one bloc, with fluid boundaries and vague criteria for inclusion. The term potentially reinforces a perception of these countries as passive recipients of aid or intervention, rather than acknowledging their agency and diverse contributions to global affairs. Arguments about the concept of a Global South notwithstanding, it is important to recognize that it is a category of countries experiencing an unprecedented level of armed conflict. In 2023, there were nearly 60 armed conflicts worldwide, the highest number ever recorded, with the vast majority occurring in regions classified as part of the Global South. Approximately 2 billion people, 1/4 of humanity, currently live in conflict-affected countries, predominantly in Africa, parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. The humanitarian toll is staggering, with civilian fatalities from armed conflicts surging by more than 30% between 2023 and 2024. At least 200,000 people were killed in conflicts in the last year alone, while over 120 million people are currently forcibly displaced, with more than half displaced within their own borders. A leading source for tracking these global conflicts has collected data that consistently shows that the highest concentration of armed conflicts occurs in Global South regions. Civil wars like those in Myanmar and Sudan generate enormous humanitarian costs with regional reverberations, creating instability that extends beyond national borders. Criminal conflicts involving drug trafficking networks, gangs and militias wreak havoc in countries including Brazil, Ecuador, Haiti, Mexico, and South Africa, in some cases generating more deaths than formal wars. Increasingly common are hybrid conflicts that fuse conventional and irregular tactics with terrorism and crime to achieve political objectives. Many conflicts that begin as internal disputes become internationalized, with external actors providing support to various factions. Example, the long-running conflict in Sudan has had several international actors supporting different factions at different times, even switching support at some moment. Libya is another instance where multiple actors have been involved, international actors as well as local actors, with people switching sides to keep the conflict going. Many conflicts that begin as internal disputes become internationalized, with external actors providing support to various factions. This internationalization makes conflicts more intractable and difficult to resolve through traditional peacekeeping approaches. Multiple factors contribute to the prevalence of conflicts in the global South. The intensification of competition between major powers like the US, China, and Russia is creating pressures on global South countries, with these powers seeking to expand their influence and often exploiting existing tensions. Institutional weaknesses at both regional and global levels undermine conflict prevention efforts, exemplified by diminishing peacekeeping missions. From 100,000 peacekeepers that used to be in place in 2016, when the number of conflicts was less, to 69,000 peacekeepers in 2024, when the number of conflicts has increased. As noted earlier, immediately following World War II, the global order was characterized by bipolarity, marked by the Cold War, a state of intense yet constrained rivalry primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. This rivalry shaped global politics across political, economic, ideological, and propagandistic fronts. Although direct military confrontation was largely avoided, tensions manifested vividly through proxy conflicts, diplomatic competition, and ideological confrontations around the world. The global South became a key battleground as newly independent nations found themselves navigating this polarized environment, often becoming arenas of indirect conflict, strategic influence, and competing pressures from these superpowers. The United States military increasingly engaged in covert operations during the Cold War to safeguard what were perceived to be American economic and geopolitical interests. In Latin America, this involvement primarily aimed to prevent socialist or communist governments from nationalizing lands and resources controlled by American corporations. Similarly, in Africa, the United States and the Soviet Union competed fiercely to extend their economic and political influence among newly independent nations. Mirroring events in Latin America, the US sought to counteract Soviet-backed governments and movements that threatened American interests, fearing the loss of strategic access and influence. Both superpowers sought to dominate these recently decolonized states, intensifying tensions and complicating these nations' effort to prevent sovereignty and autonomy. As new nations emerged after European imperialism, they often had to side with the Americans or the Soviets when they needed help. While most of the global South remained at least nominally non-aligned, approximately 1/3 of countries from global South countries explicitly aligned themselves with either bloc, with the majority tending towards insisting on non-alignment or neutrality. Non-European countries aligned with the Western Bloc included a large list of countries: Philippines, Pakistan, South Korea, Thailand, South Vietnam, Turkey, Iran until 1979, Ethiopia until 1974, South Africa until the late 1980s, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Brazil, Chile, especially after the 1973 coup, Argentina, Colombia, Nicaragua before 1979, Guatemala, El Salvador were all formal allies of the United States at one point or another. On the other hand, countries that chose to align themselves with the Soviet bloc included North Korea, North Vietnam, Afghanistan between 1978 and 1989, Mongolia, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia after the 1974 revolution, Cuba, Algeria, which had limited alignment, Libya, and Grenada, briefly until the US intervention in 1983. The rationale behind why countries sided with either the United States or the Soviet Union during the Cold War varied considerably, influenced largely by economic, political, and strategic considerations. In many cases, the United States utilized economic aid as an influential incentive, particularly for nations recovering from the debilitating effects of colonialism and extractive institutions. One of the earliest and most notable examples of American economic assistance was the Marshall Plan. Announced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, this initiative aimed explicitly at reconstructing war-ravaged European countries. Marshall diplomatically declared in his landmark speech that the plan sought to alleviate poverty, desperation, and chaos. But strategically, it also served as a mechanism to contain the expansionist ambitions of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. By promoting European economic recovery, the Marshall Plan effectively curtailed the spread of Soviet influence in Europe, linking American economic assistance directly to geopolitical strategy. Later on, subsequent US aid programs embedded American influence abroad. Programs like those administered through the United States Agency for International Development, which has just been disbanded, established in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy, institutionalized American foreign assistance within a broader Cold War context. The formation of US aid was strategically timed, occurring amid escalating Cold War tensions amplified by the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 and Cuba's declaration of alignment with Marxist-Leninist ideology and the Soviet Union in the same year. Beyond Europe, the U.S. economic aid program expanded significantly into developing countries of the global South. It was explicitly designed not only to promote economic growth, but also to build strategic, political, and military alliances. Perhaps the most celebrated success of U.S.-backed international aid during this period, apart from the Marshall Plan in Europe, was the Green Revolution in some third world countries. Spearheaded by American agronomist Dr. Norman Borlaug, the Green Revolution involved the development and distribution of high-yield, disease-resistant crop varieties, dramatically improving agricultural productivity in countries such as India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Mexico, and Indonesia. But behind all of this was a strategic aim to make sure that those countries who received this assistance and chose to be America's military allies remained military allies, and those who had chosen to be non-aligned were won over as potential military allies and partners. In contrast, the Soviet Union pursued its own form of economic assistance, aimed at reinforcing ideological alliances and enhancing its global standing. Soviet projects, such as the construction of Egypt's Aswan Dam, symbolized communist solidarity and technological advancement. Additionally, Moscow offered scholarships and training programs to students from the global South to study in Soviet institutions, thereby spreading ideological influence through educational exchanges. Compared to Western aid initiatives, Soviet assistance remained relatively limited in scope and resources, accounting for roughly just 10% of total global official development assistance during the Cold War. Eastern Bloc countries simply lacked the extensive financial resources that characterized Western aid programs, thus limiting their ability to compete economically and politically on a global scale. But there were other reasons that were involved in the opportunistic outlooks by the developing global South to leverage their asymmetry for military support and security guarantees against their foes, who were not always communists. For instance, Pakistan joined Western-led alliances like CENTO and SEATO, largely due to security concerns regarding its rival India. A global order led by the US, emerging as a victor from World War II, allowed Pakistan to sway the United States towards its establishment at the expense of Indian intimacy towards Americans. Joining CENTO and SEATO offered protection, political backing, military hardware, jets, tanks, artillery, and training for armed forces, economic support, infrastructure development, airfields, radar installations, and political support from the US over the Kashmir dispute in the United Nations. Military regimes in the global South frequently leveraged foreign military aid, particularly from the United States, to reinforce and consolidate their authoritarian rule internally, suppress opposition, and maintain regime stability. For example, during General Augusto Pinochet's rule in Chile, the regime received substantial US support, including more than $120 million in military assistance between 1974 and 1980 alone. This military aid significantly enhanced the regime's capability to suppress internal dissent, control opposition movements, and solidify its political power through force. No. Yeah. Yes, Afi. I can go on? Okay, good. That was a good moment because it was focused on how military aid enhanced various regimes' capabilities at home. But in some ways, the critics of that military assistance are right in saying that it did not necessarily enhance the security of the aid donor. For example, what was the direct benefit in terms of global security or US security policy of the aid that was given to the Pinochet regime in Chile? Similarly, Pakistan, under the military dictatorship of General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq from 1977 to 1988, received approximately $3.8 billion in US economic and military assistance following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Zia's regime strategically utilized this substantial influx of resources, advanced weaponry, intelligence support, and direct financial assistance to fortify its authoritarian grip domestically and to systematically weaken political opposition and prolong military rule. Comparable patterns emerged in Latin American countries like Argentina and Brazil, where military regimes utilized millions of dollars in US-provided arms, intelligence cooperation, and economic aid to repress internal leftist insurgencies, control political discourse, and solidify military authoritarian governance. Newly independent states prioritized sovereignty, autonomy, and self-reliance, actively resisting external dependencies that might introduce forms of indirect control. This colonial legacy bred skepticism toward military partnerships in some countries, reinforcing fears that such alliances could compromise national sovereignty or perpetuate historical patterns of traumatic subjugation through security dependencies. The non-aligned movement, founded during the Cold War, epitomized the Global South's skepticism toward military alliances, particularly those led by former colonizers or superpowers. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, as well as Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, erstwhile Yugoslavia, emphasized sovereignty, independence, and neutrality. At the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia, representatives from 29 newly independent African and Asian countries explicitly condemned colonialism and emphasized non-alignment as the cornerstone of their foreign policy. They opposed aligning militarily with either the capitalist West, the USA and former European colonizers, or the communist East, the Soviet Union, precisely because of concerns about quote-unquote neocolonialism and loss of sovereignty. The non-aligned movement aimed to establish an independent trajectory in global politics to prevent member countries from becoming tools or proxies in conflicts between major global powers. There is always huge distance between desire and accomplishment, and the non-aligned movement in many ways represents that huge distance. Even though the principles such as the right to independent decision-making, resistance against imperialism and neo-colonial influences, and the practice of impartiality and moderation in international affairs was the declared objective, it was not always achieved. The Cold War alliances between the Global South and the superpowers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, brought significant benefits to some developing countries. These alliances provided access to resources, technology, and infrastructure that many nations in the Global South would not have been able to secure on their own. For instance, the United States invested heavily in economic development, education, and healthcare through initiatives like the Alliance for Progress. India and Pakistan both were able to develop nuclear programs through the Atoms for Peace cooperative program initiated by the United States. The United States provided something to the tune of $20 billion in economic aid to Latin America between 1961 and 1970 to promote development and to counter communism. This aid helped build critical infrastructure such as roads, schools, and hospitals, and supported agricultural and industrial projects that laid the foundation for future growth. Countries like South Korea and Taiwan are prime examples of how aid and trade opportunities were leveraged to achieve rapid economic development and technological advancement. South Korea received over $12 billion in U.S. economic and military aid between 1945 and 1976, which helped transform it from a war-torn nation into one of the world's leading economies. Similarly, Taiwan used U.S. support to develop its manufacturing and technology sectors, becoming a global hub for electronics and innovation. These success stories highlight the transformative potential of Cold War alliances when combined with effective, successful domestic policies. The Soviet Union also played a crucial role in supporting industrialization and modernization in many developing countries. Soviet aid often came in the form of technical expertise, machinery, and infrastructure projects, which helped countries like India, Egypt, and Cuba build factories, power plants, and transportation networks. For example, the Soviet Union provided $1.5 billion in economic aid to India during the 1960s, including support for heavy industries like steel production, which became the backbone of India's economy. In Cuba, Soviet subsidies amounted to $4 to $6 billion annually during the 1980s, primarily through preferential trade agreements for sugar and oil. This support enabled Cuba to develop its sugar industry and provided access to essential resources which were critical to its survival during the US embargo. These investments not only boosted economic productivity, but also created jobs and improved living standards for many people. Beyond economic benefits, the alliances provided political and military support that helped many countries maintain their sovereignty and resist external threats. For instance, US military aid to South Korea during the Korean War and its ongoing security guarantees helped the country defend itself against North Korean aggression, allowing it to focus on economic development. Similarly, Soviet military support to countries like Vietnam and Angola enabled them to resist their enemies and also to achieve independence. In Africa alone, the USSR provided over $10 billion in economic and military aid between 1955 and 1989, supporting liberation movements and post-independence governments in countries like Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. In many cases, this support was crucial in helping nations assert their autonomy and build stable governments. There is more data on how the military assistance as well as the economic assistance went hand in hand and had various impacts depending on how the recipient behaved internally and what kind of policies they pursued. But one of the most significant drawbacks of military alliances during the Cold War was the dependency they create. Many countries in the global south relied heavily on military and economic aid from the superpowers to maintain themselves. Another major drawback was the prolongation of conflicts in the global south. Military alliances often exacerbated rather than resolved conflicts, as superpowers armed opposing factions to advance their geopolitical goals. For instance, US support for anti-communist forces and Soviet backing for revolutionary movements fueled civil wars in countries like Angola, Mozambique, and Afghanistan, and the impact of that backing for various factions continues to roil these countries to this day. The influx of military aid also led to economic distortions in the global south. The militarization of the global south during the Cold War had significant environmental and social costs. Military operations and the production of weapons led to environmental degradation, including deforestation, pollution, and the destruction of agricultural land. Additionally, the presence of foreign troops and military bases sometimes disrupts local communities and cultures. The US military presence in the Philippines and South Vietnam led to social tensions and conflicts with local populations, while Soviet military activities in Africa often displaced communities and disrupted traditional ways of life. Finally, the neglect of local needs was a recurring issue in Cold War military alliances. Aid was frequently tied to strategic objectives rather than the development of priorities of recipient countries. For instance, Soviet aid to Cuba focused on sugar production and military support while neglecting other sectors of the economy. Similarly, US aid to South Vietnam prioritized military objectives over economic and social development, contributing to the country's instability and eventually to the failure of American objectives. This focus on superpower interests often led the real needs of the global south unaddressed, perpetuating poverty and inequality. The Cold War era experience of alliances has made most countries of the global south wary of formal military alliance. As the United States, the major champion of formal treaties as an instrument of alliances, backs away from its global commitments under President Trump, the suspicion of alliances already manifested in much of the global south will be reinforced. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, argued the military alliances were inherently unequal, requiring smaller nations to subordinate their interests to those of more powerful states. Instead, he advocated for a world order based on parallelism and lateralism, principles emphasizing equality and mutual respect in international relations. Parallelism, as Nehru envisioned it, requires that similar problems will be addressed with similar norms and approaches, regardless of the size of a nation or its power. Lateralism, on the other hand, stressed the moral equivalencies necessary for fair agreements, symbolically suspending power asymmetries to enable equitable negotiations. These principles were central to the Bandung Conference and to subsequent evolution of the non-aligned movement. Nehru's idealistic concept remains alive, but the practicalities of power politics continue to highlight the need for military alliance. Most post-colonial nations have shown a strong preference for economic groupings, which align more closely with their developmental goals and aspirations for a multipolar world rather than military ones. The rise of organizations like BRICS, the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States reflects this trend. These groupings emphasize economic cooperation, trade, and investment, offering an alternative to the military-centric framework of traditional alliances. More recently, there has also been a move towards minilateralism, which is smaller coalitions of countries focused on one or two very specific goals. Currently, with the US pulling back from the world, many countries are redefining the principles of their engagement with other nations. The responses of countries to conflict remains varied, with no single stance clearly dominating across the global South. These varied responses are seen quite clearly in the global South's international engagements regarding the war in Ukraine. At the United Nations General Assembly, many global South nations supported a key resolution, the one adopted on October 12, 2022, condemning Russia's attempted annexation of Ukraine, but a significant number abstained. The African Union, on the other hand, called for an immediate ceasefire coupled with prolonged negotiations to ensure lasting peace. Not that that resolution had any effect. With the US being less willing to offer assistance and concessions as an incentive to secure support, there will be a rise in the tendency of global South nations to take a neutral or non-aligned stance in conflicts and issues not immediately related to them. We might also see a rise in opportunistic partnerships between countries of the global South and developed countries. The vacuum created by the end of American economic and military assistance to many countries might be filled by China or Europe or both. It is unlikely that we will see an end to wars, nor is it likely that the period of great prosperity for Americans at the expense of the rest of the world, as envisaged by President Trump, will materialize. But there will be significant convulsions across the global South in the years ahead, with little mitigation from the steadying hand of a superpower. We will see an increase in local, regional, and internal conflict. We will all be constantly reminded of the Chinese saying, "Better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos." Human beings, be warned of the chaos that is coming. Thank you all very much. FTBE.